On this day, April 17th, 1961, the disastrous Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba took place. How many of you have heard of the Bay of Pigs? And how many of you actually know what happened? Okay, so first, we need some context. Our really bad relationship with Cuba goes back to 1959, when a young revolutionary by the name of Fidel Castro drove his guerrilla army into the streets of Havana and overthrew the government led by President Bautista. Now, Bautista was by no means a good guy, but he kind of let American businesses do their thing in Cuba, and most importantly, he was a staunch anti-communist. This was the Cold War after all. So he gets like an A- in America's book. Castro, on the other hand, had been stirring trouble in the jungles of Cuba for a few years now, bringing together an army and mass public support to launch an all-out communist revolution in the country. If there was a grade worse than an F, America would give it to Castro. Nonetheless, he won the revolution, took over the country, and there wasn't really much that America could do about it. But that doesn't mean they didn't try. As Cuba got closer and closer to the Soviet Union, they became more and more of a threat to the United States. Remember, at this time, the domino theory was the driving theory behind a lot of America's foreign policy. The domino theory basically was this policy that was made based on the presumption that if one country fell to communism, all of the surrounding countries would fall too. The goal? Prevent that from happening at all costs. Sound familiar, Vietnam? So, fast forward to 1969. And the new President Kennedy has just inherited a top secret CIA operation. The plan was to recruit Cuban exiles living in Miami and train them to overthrow Castro, okay? Now, Kennedy was skeptical that this could work, but the CIA's stance was it would be a win-win. You know, if they're successful, Castro would be out, and if they're not, well, it's never gonna be linked back to the US. Now, the whole thing was a disaster that would be hilarious if it wasn't such a tragedy. They had designated the Bay of Pigs, which is this small cove-like reef on the south shore of the island. Side note, I actually got to go diving there when I went to Cuba, and I had like a huge freak out history nerd moment. It was super cool. Okay, so first, a whole bunch of the ships coming in hit the coral reefs and sink. You can actually see a lot of them to this day in the reef at the bottom of the ocean. Anyway, then the backup paratroopers land in the wrong freaking place. And then meanwhile, the CIA somehow missed the fact that the entire time the Cuban national radio was broadcasting the entire fiasco to listeners across Cuba. In less than 24 hours, Castro's troops had cornered the rebels on the beach. And with no air support from the US, they surrendered after only 3 days of fighting. 114 were killed and over 1,100 were taken prisoner. Several of those prisoners were executed. The whole thing was pretty traumatic. It can be said that the embarrassment that followed Kennedy in the aftermath of the Bay of Pigs disaster was the motivating force behind a lot of the subsequent US policy towards Cuba. The relationship continued to deteriorate until not long after a complete trade and travel embargo was issued, and that has remained in place pretty much until Obama came in and made it a priority of his administration to improve relationships between the US and its closest non-bordering neighbor. Okay, and now, want to hear an interesting fun fact? So, America's most notorious prison, Guantanamo, is on Cuban land. The U.S. has leased the land from Cuba per an agreement since 1903. But since the revolution in 1959, the Cuban government has consistently protested American presence there, calling it illegal. Nonetheless, the U.S. continues to send an annual check of $4,085 per their agreement, and Cuba continues to throw it away in a silent protest.